2050. The most prominent in 2008 was the Lieberman-Warner bill. It would require a 70% emissions cut.
When we analyzed the impact of the Lieberman-Warner bill, we found three things. Incomes go down, taxes go up, and jobs go away.
Lieberman-Warner would reduce cumulative U.S. GDP by $5 trillion during 2012 to 2030. Let's put that in perspective. A typical hurricane striking a U.S. coastal community does about $5 billion in damage.
Well, adjusting for increases in wealth over the next 20 years, that means that the damage done by Lieberman-Warner in economic terms is the equivalent of over 600 hurricanes. Now, normally we have slightly less than 2 hurricanes per year that make landfall. So this is order of magnitudes worse than the damage that would be done by these weather storms, the hurricanes. That's a big hit to the economy.
Yikes. Let's look at some of the policies Gore and others advocate to cut emissions by 70% and more. First and foremost, they want to ban construction of new coal-fired power plants. Why? Coal is the most carbon-intensive fuel. It releases the most carbon dioxide per unit of energy produced. More importantly, emissions from new coal plants are expected to swamp by as much as 5-to-1 all the emission reductions that Europe, Canada, and Japan might achieve under the UN Global Warming Treaty, the Kyoto Protocol. Either global warming activists kill coal or coal will bury Kyoto. To be fair, the activists say they'll allow new coal generation if the power plants deploy something called CCS, carbon capture and storage technology. The idea is that instead of releasing CO2 into the air, the power stations would capture it, liquefy it, and then transport it to underground storage sites. There's just one problem. No commercial coal plants today have CCS technology. I asked Mary Hutzler, formerly head of analysis at the Energy Information Administration, how long it might take just to determine whether a CCS system would be economical for utilities to build.
There probably requires an immense amount of research and development. People have told me 10 to 15 years alone.
Mary also told me that building a national CCS pipeline network could take another decade. Developing the regulations would also take years. So the proposed moratorium is really a ban on new coal plants for 20 years or more. What's the risk here? New coal generation is forecast to supply 2/3 of all new electric power over the next 2 decades. By 2030, new coal generation is expected to provide 15% of all our electricity. So banning it could create one heck of a power deficit. Frequent blackouts and power failures and energy crisis would not be an unlikely consequence. At a minimum, our electric bills would go way up. But Al Gore is not content to ban new coal plants. He now proposes to scrap all existing coal plants and natural gas power plants too. He says we must replace all carbon-based electricity with carbon-free electricity in just 10 years by 2018.
The idea is absolutely off the charts, unrealistic.
Al Gore is proposing the literally, physically impossible.
Coal and natural gas provide 70% of our electricity. Wind, solar, geothermal, and biomass provide 2%. Any attempt to expand that 2% to replace the 70% from coal and natural gas in just 10 years would fail dismally. Your electric bills would skyrocket because the demand for renewable energy, ramped up by government mandates, would vastly exceed supply. And talk about government waste, Gore's plan would dismantle hundreds of profitable coal and gas plants long before the end of their useful lives. Now let's look at the international side of climate policy. Al Gore and the European Union advocate a 50% cut in global emissions by 2050. But most of the growth in global emissions between now and then will come from developing countries. So those countries too will have to stop building coal plants. They too will have to limit their use of fossil fuels. It would be a humanitarian disaster. Globally, about 1.6 billion people lack access to electricity, and about 2.4 billion still rely on traditional biomass, wood, crop waste, even dung for cooking and heating. Kenya's energy system typifies the plight of millions of people around the world. The energy source is wood chopped from the forest. The energy transmission system is the backs of women and girls. The energy use system is burning the wood in an open fire indoors for heat and light. Respiratory disease from the indoor air pollution in huts like those kills more than 1 million people a year, most of them women and children.
If you look at developing countries, the thing they need most of all is commercial energy and electricity. People in developing countries spend most of their day collecting fuel. They don't have time to go to school and get an education. It gets dark at night, so there's no studying at night because there's no electricity. Electricity is the essential commodity for any kind of growth and improvement in lifestyle.
A coal-fired power plant would improve the lives of those villagers in many ways. Women would be freed from backbreaking toil. People would be healthier because indoor air quality would improve. Refrigeration would make food preparation easier and safer. Electric lighting would allow people to read and study at night. The forests and the species dependent on them would be spared.
I agree with former Vice President Gore that global warming is a moral issue. I think it is preeminently a moral issue because we have 1.5 billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity, for example. The world is not energy rich, it's energy poor. And if we are going to put energy rationing policies on the backs of the world's poorest people, they will have very little hope of ever achieving even a fraction of the well-being, of the lifestyle that we have.
India is an emerging industrial powerhouse, yet even in India, energy poverty kills. India has the largest incidence of snake bites in the world. About 50,000 Indians die from snake bites each year. Doctors there have developed an anti-venom antidote. So why is the death toll so high?
The primary reason that most Indian health centers, particularly in rural areas where the snake bite is more prevalent, have no electricity, no refrigeration, no way of storing the antivenom. The technology is there. We know how to generate electricity. The technology is there. We know how to make antivenom. Yet, 95% of Indians or thereabouts do not have access to it because they stay in areas which cannot store antivenom in a refrigerated environment.
Let me state the obvious. Poverty is the #1 cause of premature death and preventable disease in the world. Global restrictions on fossil energy use would trap millions of people in poverty. Al Gore and others don't say exactly how they would stop poor countries from using coal, but some U.S. and European politicians want to impose carbon tariffs on goods from China and other developing countries that refuse to limit emissions.
I think the question to ask here is, can any of the potential effects of climate change be so great as to justify keeping the developed world in poverty? I think to ask that question is to answer it.
If stopping new coal is the global warming movement's top priority, a close second is jump-starting a beyond petroleum transport system. They propose to do this by tightening new car fuel economy standards. Why? A car that gets more miles to the gallon emits less CO2 per mile. But the federal fuel economy program, also known as CAFE, has serious downsides.
Now, there are lots of problems with fuel economy mandates. For one thing, they raise new car prices. Secondly, they restrict consumer choice. But the worst thing is in the fact that you never hear their advocates talking about. Namely, fuel economy mandates kill people.
Here's why. Heavier cars provide more mass to absorb collision forces, and bigger cars provide more space between the occupant and the point of impact. Make a car smaller and lighter, and it will go farther on a gallon of gas.
But you also make it less safe. According to the National Academy of Sciences, the current CAFE standards, by downsizing cars, contribute to about 2,000 fatalities per year.
Legislation Congress passed in December 2007 requires a 40% increase in fuel economy by 2020. In 2007, only 2 out of 1,153 vehicle models met the new standards, so expect more downsizing in the years ahead. Another beyond petroleum policy is to require the sale of alternative fuels. In December 2007, Congress also mandated that motor fuel producers sell 36 billion gallons of ethanol a year by 2022, with 15 billion gallons coming from corn kernels. The result? We're diverting massive quantities of grain from food to auto fuel. This contributes to the surge in global grain prices that is pushing millions of the world's poorest people to the brink of starvation. But at least ethanol cuts down on CO2 emissions, right? Actually, no.
As we expand the cropland, then we get into the real trouble because we release the greenhouse gas that's stored in the soil as carbon. And With corn, we release twice as much gas